The heavy oak door of the eastern tower chamber rattled against the winter wind. I sat on the edge of a narrow, unmade bed, my fingers entirely numb from the chill radiating off the bare stone floor. Through the single frosted window, the sprawling estate of Oakhaven looked exactly as it had when my father ruled it. Before the coup, before the slaughter, before my name was erased from the kingdom's memory. Now I was simply Lara, a nameless companion to Lady Vesper, tolerated only because keeping the former princess as a glorified servant amused the new lord of the estate, Duke Julian Vance. My spine was rigid, held entirely straight despite the trembling in my shoulders. The tight faded fabric of my wool dress dug into my ribs, a constant scratching reminder of everything I had lost. But physical discomfort was nothing. It was the silence in the room that was suffocating me. I stared at the loose floorboard beneath the rusted wash basin. It was pried open. The small space beneath it was empty. My chest seized. The air vanished from my lungs. I had hidden it there 3 nights ago. A single letter folded tightly and sealed not with cheap wax but with the heavy, undeniable crest of the Silver Griffin. The royal seal of House Valerius. The only physical proof that the blood of the true king still ran through my veins. I'd written it in a moment of pure blinding weakness on the anniversary of my brother Cassian's death. I'd written it to him, pouring out the agony of my existence, the bitter realities of watching another man sit in our father's chair, the humiliation of bowing to the very traitors who had orchestrated our family's ruin. And inside that folded parchment I had tucked the brass matrix of the seal itself, the last thing Cassian had sent me from the northern battlefields, before a blade took his life. I knew the danger. I knew that writing those words was an act of high treason under the new regime. If found, it would mean execution. I'd planned to burn it in the hearth this morning, to watch the smoke swallow my grief so I could survive another day. But the floorboard was empty. Footsteps echoed on the spiral stairs outside my room. They were not the hurried, shuffling steps of a maid. They were heavy measured and dripping with arrogant purpose. The door swung open without a knock. Duke Julian Vance stood in the doorway. He was dressed in midnight velvet, a silver chain draped across his chest. His smile was sharp, thin, and terrifyingly amused. In his right hand he tapped a thick folded piece of parchment against his thigh. I saw the glint of the brass seal tucked partially inside it. I did not gasp. I did not flinch. I had spent 4 years learning how to bury my terror beneath a mask of absolute unyielding calm. I stood up slowly, crossing my hands in front of me, forcing my chin parallel to the cold floor. "You have been holding out on us, little bird," Julian said. His voice was smooth like poison poured over ice. He stepped into the room, his dark eyes scanning the miserable conditions he forced me to live in. Such a tragic tale. Such grand delusions of stolen crowns and royal blood, I confess I wept reading it. I give it back, your grace, I said. My voice was quiet, steady, though my heart was violently battering against my ribs. Julian chuckled, walking closer. He stopped inches from me, the heavy scent of musk and expensive wine rolling off him. Give it back. A document of treason. A pathetic diary of a servant girl pretending to be a dead princess. Oh no, this is far too valuable. It is a masterpiece of fiction. The seal is a nice touch too. Stolen from the old vaults, I assume. He didn't know. He thought it was a fake. He thought I was a mad woman clinging to a fantasy. The realization offered a brief, desperate sliver of hope, but it was instantly crushed by his next words. My sister is hosting the state banquet tonight. Julian continued tapping the letter against my cheek. I refused to blink. The entire noble court will be present. Even the King of Aldoria has graced us with his presence on his route south. It is an evening of high culture and entertainment, and I have decided that your little tragedy is exactly the sort of amusement our esteemed guests require. The cold that had settled in my bones turned to pure, paralyzing dread. I am not going to read it, Alara. He smiled, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. You are. You will stand before the king, before the nobles who own your miserable life, and you will read every pathetic, treasonous word. And when they laugh, you will kneel on the marble and beg their forgiveness for your royal delusions. Julian's smile vanished. His hand shot out, his fingers closing around my jaw with crushing force. He leaned in, his breath warm and foul. If you do not walk into that banquet hall tonight, I will have the guards drag you by your hair. And tomorrow I will turn you out into the snow without a coat, without a copper coin, and without a reference. You will freeze in the gutters before morning. You are nothing but dirt beneath my boots. You will do exactly as I say. He shoved me backward. I stumbled, catching myself against the stone wall. The rough edge tore the skin of my palm, but I did not look away from him. Wear something clean! Julian sneered, turning toward the door. We wouldn't want the king to think we keep our livestock in pure filth. The banquet begins at 8. Do not keep your audience waiting. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped room. I sank down onto the bare mattress. I looked at my trembling hands. The blood from the scrape on my palm was a bright, vivid crimson against my pale skin. Royal blood. The blood of kings and queens, of conquerors and rulers, now reduced to the plaything of a usurping duke. I closed my eyes and Cassian's face flashed in my mind. His bright, defiant smile. His promise to return. Hold the seal, Elysia, he had told me the night before he rode to war. As long as you hold it, the kingdom is not lost. I took a deep, shuddering breath. The corset tightened around my chest, but my spine straightened on its own. I would go to the banquet. I would face the court. But I would not let them see me break. If I was to be humiliated before the throne, I would wear my pain with the absolute dignity of the queen I was born to be. The wardrobe in the corner of my room held exactly 3 garments. 2 were plain wool dresses suited for scrubbing hearths and serving tea to the lower staff. The 3rd was the gown of ashes. That was what Cassian had called it once, in a rare moment of dark humor, when he had caught me mending the frayed hem by candlelight. But it was a gown of heavy slate-grey silk handed down from Lady Vespra 3 years ago, when she deemed the colour too dull for her complexion. The housekeeper had ordered the bodice to fit my much narrower frame, a silent act of pity I tolerated, only because it was strictly practical. I pulled the dress from its iron hook, the silk freezing against my bare fingertips. Stripping off my rough work dress, I stood shivering in the dim, bitter air of the tower chamber. I laced my own corset, pulling the strings tight, tying them in a harsh knot at the small of my back. It was a cruel restriction, making every breath shallow and deliberate. But tonight I needed the armor. I needed the tight binding against my ribs to hold my fracturing composure together. I stepped into the grey silk and smoothed the heavy skirts down my legs. Having no maid to assist me, I brushed my dark hair until my scalp ached, pinning it up at the nape of my neck in a severe, unadorned twist. I had no jewellery. The Valerius diamonds, the heavy gold chokers, the sapphire drop earrings that had belonged to my mother, they were all locked securely in Julian's vaults. My only ornament tonight would be my posture. I looked at my reflection in the cracked looking glass above the wash basin. The glass distorted my features into jagged pieces, pale skin, dark eyes, lips pressed into a hard, bloodless line. I did not look like Alara, the quiet companion who kept her eyes carefully glued to the floorboards. Tonight, despite the faded grey silk and the freezing room, I looked exactly like my father's daughter. The clock in the distant courtyard struck 7:30. It was time. I left the tower chamber and descended the spiral servant stairs. These secret arteries of Oakhaven had been built by my ancestors to keep the unseen labour of the castle out of the royal family's sight. Now they were the only paths I was permitted to walk. At the base of the stairs, the narrow corridor opened into the lower gallery. Here the biting dampness of the stone gave way to the heavy perfumed warmth of the main keep. The air smelled of beeswax candles, roasting meats, and heavy rose perfume. It was the scent of my childhood twisted into a violent mockery by the people who had stolen it. I walked slowly along the edge of the gallery, my flat leather shoes making no sound on the runner carpets. I passed the alcove where the marble bust of the first Valerius king used to sit. It was empty now, the stone likely smashed and tossed into the river. Dragging my fingertips lightly against the cold wall, I felt the castle humming beneath my touch with a quiet ancient sorrow. It remembered me even if the kingdom had been ordered to forget my name. As I neared the northern wing, the distant hum of conversation and the light strains of a string quartet drifted down the long corridor. The state banquet was being held in the great hall, a cavernous room of sweeping arches that had once served as my father's throne room. They were playing a waltz, a spinning, frivolous melody that felt deeply offensive in a room where my family's blood had been washed from the flagstones. I reached the antechamber outside the great hall. 4 guards in the midnight and silver livery of House Vance stood before the massive oak doors. When they saw me approach, their expressions shifted from disciplined blankness to open disdain. I was a known entity to them, the usurping lord's pet tragic figure. Lost your mop? Elara, one of the guards sneered, shifting his heavy pike. I did not break my stride or turn my head. I stopped exactly 3 paces from the grand doors, my hands folded neatly at my waist, my spine perfectly straight. Open the doors, I said. My voice was low, entirely devoid of inflection, yet carrying a cold, undeniable authority that I had not allowed myself to use in 4 years. The guard blinked momentarily, taken aback by the absolute lack of fear in my tone. Julian had ordered my presence, which meant they had no actual authority to keep me out. With a grating squeal of heavy iron hinges, the guards pushed the massive doors open. The light hit me like a physical blow. Hundreds of beeswax candles blazed in the massive crystal chandeliers, suspended from the vaulted ceiling. The hall was a sea of moving colors, emerald velvets, crimson silks, the flash of gold embroidery, and the icy glitter of stolen diamonds. The long banquet table stretched down the center of the room, crowded with the highest nobles of the realm. And at the far end, elevated on a dais exactly where my father's throne used to sit, was the high table. I stood perfectly still on the threshold. For a long, suffocating moment, the noise of the room faded into a ringing silence in my ears. The sheer audacity of the scene before me was a physical pressure against my chest. There was Lord Herring, who had sworn eternal allegiance to my father, laughing loudly over a cup of wine. There was Lady Crestmont, wearing my mother's sapphire earrings as if they were her own. They were drinking and celebrating in the graveyard of my family. I forced myself to breathe. The heavy grey silk of my gown felt suddenly like a suit of iron armor. I stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the blinding light. My flat shoes stepped onto the polished white marble. I did not look at the faces of the nobles turning to stare at the drab grey figure entering their glittering feast. I fixed my gaze firmly on the dais at the far end of the hall. I was walking to my own execution. Julian Vance was waiting for me with my bloodline's deepest secrets folded in his pocket. He intended to strip away the final shreds of my dignity and leave me naked and humiliated before the kingdom. But as I walked down the long, agonizing length of the hall, the silence sharpening my fury into absolute grace, I made a silent vow to the stone walls around me. They could force me to my knees. They could mock my name, but they would never make me bow in my heart. The gown of ashes would be worn like royal velvet tonight. I moved through the great hall like a ghost haunting its own grave. The whispers started before I had even reached the halfway point of the long banquet table. They were not quiet. The nobility of this new era did not possess the elegance to hide their malice. I heard the hiss of silk skirts shifting as ladies leaned together behind their painted fans. I caught the cruel, sharp syllables of the word beggar, the word servant, the word tragic. I kept my eyes fixed on the heavy tapestries behind the high table, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Lady Vespera was waiting for me at the edge of the dais. She wore a gown of crushed crimson velvet that made her look like an open wound against the pale marble. Diamonds glittered at her throat, a stark contrast to my bare collarbones. She smiled as I approached, a thin, satisfied expression that did not reach her pale eyes. "You are late, Elara," she murmured, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the lord sitting nearest to the dais. "Sit. Try not to ruin the aesthetic of the evening with your sulking." My seat was not at the high table. It was a small, uncushioned wooden stool placed slightly behind and to the left of Vespera's chair. It was the position of a footman or a dog. I stepped up onto the dais, feeling the collective gaze of 100 traitors burning into my back. I arranged my faded grey skirts and sat down on the hard wood. My spine remained straight as a blade. I rested my hands in my lap, hiding the stinging scrape on my palm, and locked my jaw behind a mask of absolute freezing calm. The banquet was a grotesque display of excess. Course after course of roasted swan-spiced wine and spun sugar was paraded down the center aisle. The laughter grew louder, more raucous, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. Duke Julian sat at the center of the high table, occupying the massive carved chair that had once been my father's throne. He looked deeply pleased with himself, swirling wine in a golden goblet, occasionally whispering to the sycophants leaning in around him. Then the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open again. The blast of the herald's trumpets cut through the noise of the feast like a sharp blade. The laughter died instantly. The clinking of silver against porcelain ceased. A sudden breathless hush fell over the great hall. Announcing His Royal Majesty, the herald's voice echoed, ringing with absolute terror and respect. "Kaelen of House Vance is not his name. Kaelen of Eldoria, The Winter King, the Sovereign of the North. The entire room stood up in unison. Chairs scraped loudly against the stone. Julian Vance rose from my father's throne, his arrogant smile replaced by a tight, practiced expression of deep deference. I remained on my stool in the shadows for a fraction of a second longer than the rest, my breath catching in my throat before I too stood and lowered my head. King Kaelen walked into the hall. He brought the winter with him. The atmosphere in the room plummeted, the heavy, perfumed warmth instantly crushed by the sheer, staggering weight of his presence. He was not dressed in the ostentatious silks and jewels that the southern nobles favored. He wore a tunic of midnight leather and a heavy cloak of dark wolf fur that swept over the cold marble with every measured stride. His crown was not a towering display of gold, but a simple jagged circlet of black iron resting against his dark hair. I dared to raise my eyes just a fraction. He was a man carved from war. His jaw was locked behind royal calm, his features sharp, ruthless, and terrifyingly still. A faint jagged scar ran down the side of his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his tunic. His eyes sweeping over the kneeling court were the color of storm clouds, entirely devoid of warmth. Cassian had written to me of this man. They had fought shoulder to shoulder in the blood mud of the northern valleys. Cassian had said that Kaelen was a ruler who spoke only when the world needed changing, a king who understood the heavy, unforgiving cost of a crown. Kaelen owed his life to my brother, but he did not know who I was. To him, Cassian's sister was a nameless girl lost to the ashes of a fallen kingdom, and I was merely a shadow in a grey dress standing behind a usurper's sister. Kaelen ascended the dais. His heavy boots echoed like war drums. Julian Vance bowed so deeply his chin nearly touched the table. Your Majesty, Julian said, his voice slick with manufactured reverence. Kaelen is infinitely honored by your presence. We have prepared a feast worthy of your glorious victories. Kaelen did not smile. He did not immediately speak. He stood at the center of the dais, his gloved hands stilled at his sides, letting the agonizing silence stretch until the air in the room felt thick enough to choke on. He looked at Julian as one might look at a particularly unpleasant insect. I am not here for a feast, Kaelen said. His voice was low, deep, and carried a dangerous resonance that made the crystal glasses on the table tremble. I require lodgings for my men for one night. I will rest for the capital at dawn. Of course, Your Majesty. Julian stammered, gesturing desperately to an empty chair at his right hand. Please, sit. The kingdom is yours. Kaelen unfastened his heavy fur cloak. Two of his Kingsguard stepped forward instantly to take it. He sat down. The movement was entirely controlled, the grace of a predator resting in a room full of prey. Only when the king was seated did the rest of the hall dare to lower themselves back into their chairs. The feast resumed, but the energy had violently shifted. The loud drunken laughter was gone, replaced by nervous murmurs, and the careful quiet clinking of silverware. Julian was visibly sweating, trying desperately to engage the Winter King in conversation. Kaelen gave him nothing. He drank his wine in silence, his storm-dark eyes occasionally scanning the room, analyzing the exits, the guards, the weak points of the hall. I stood behind Vespera, perfectly still, wishing the stone floor would open up and swallow me. I knew what Julian was doing. I saw the desperate, calculating look in his eyes. He was failing to impress the king with wealth, failing to impress him with military talk. Julian needed something else to assert his dominance in his own hall. He needed a spectacle. Julian's hand drifted toward the inner pocket of his velvet coat. My heart slammed against my ribs. The corset tightened, cutting off my air. The blood rushed entirely from my face. I watched Julian's fingers brush the edge of the folded parchment hidden against his chest. He was going to do it. He was going to drag my soul out into the blistering light of this chandelier-lit room right in front of the man my brother had died to save. The sharp, piercing chime of silver striking gold cut through the muted murmurs of the great hall. Duke Julian Vance stood at the center of the high table, a heavy silver spoon poised against the rim of his goblet. He waited until the entire room had fallen into a breathless, expectant silence. Even the string quartet in the upper gallery abruptly ceased playing, leaving the crackle of the massive hearth fires as the only sound into the cavernous room. I did not breathe. If I drew breath, the tightly laced corset would snap my ribs, or worse, it would betray the violent, frantic trembling that was threatening to tear me apart from the inside. I kept my eyes locked on the space just above Julian's left shoulder, staring at the tapestries that used to bear my family's silver crest. My lords, my ladies. Julian's voice boomed rich and dripping with manufactured charm. He turned his body slightly, bowing his head toward the imposing figure seated to his right. And to our most glorious guest, His Majesty King Kaelen. We are men of power, men who carry the heavy burdens of state and sword. Peace, while prosperous, can sometimes prove terribly dull to those who have conquered the world. A smattering of polite sycophantic laughter rippled through the noble court. Kaelen of Eldoria did not laugh. He did not even blink. He leaned back slowly in his chair, his storm-dark eyes resting heavily on Julian. The Winter King looked exactly like a predator watching a lesser animal play with a trap. To remedy this, Julian continued completely oblivious to the lethal stillness radiating from the man beside him. I have promised you an entertainment tonight. A small diversion. You see, a most singular and highly amusing document came into my possession this morning. Julian's hand slipped into the breast pocket of his midnight velvet coat. When he withdrew it, he was holding the thick-folded parchment. The sight of it hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. My fingers dug so deeply into my own palms that I felt the crescent moons of my nails breaking the skin, mixing new blood with the dried scrape from the tower wall. The paper was slightly crumpled, now desecrated by his touch. I could not see the heavy brass matrix of the royal seal from where I stood. But I knew it was there, trapped in the folds of my deepest grief. It is a letter, Julian announced to the room, waving the parchment lazily in the air. Written in the dead of night, hidden away like a grand treasonous secret beneath the floorboards of the servants' quarters. A collective gasp of dramatic manufactured shock swept through the hall. Lady Vespera, seated just in front of me, let out a soft, cruel giggle behind her painted silk fan. Who wrote it? Your Grace, called out Lord Herring from the centre of the banquet table, playing his part perfectly. That is the finest part of the jest. Julian smiled, his dark eyes glittering with malice. He turned his head slowly, his gaze slicing through the candlelight, to find me standing in the shadows. It is a work of absolute fiction, a pathetic delusional tragedy penned by a creature who scrubs our flaws, yet fancies herself a lost royal of the old bloodline, a girl who genuinely believes she is a banished queen crying out to a dead ghost for a stolen throne. The laughter that erupted from the court was not polite this time. It was a vicious, howling sound. It bounced off the vaulted ceilings and rained down on me like stones. They were laughing at my blood. They were laughing at Cassian's sacrifice. They were laughing at the systematic slaughter of my entire house, reduced to a punchline in my own father's hall. Kaelen's expression remained entirely unreadable. He did not join in the laughter, but his jaw shifted slightly, a microscopic tightening of muscle. He stared at the folded paper in Julian's hand, a faint flicker of irritation crossing his scarred features, as if he found the cruelty distasteful, but entirely beneath his royal interference. Come forward, Ilara, Julian commanded, his voice turning suddenly sharp, cracking like a whip over the dying laughter. Step into the light, where your betters can see you. I didn't move for a fraction of a second. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee back up the servant stairs, and throw myself from the eastern tower before they could strip my soul bare. But my legs were forged from the same iron as the crown they had stolen. I stepped out from behind Lady Vespera's chair. The grey silk of my gown whispered against the polished marble. I walked to the edge of the dais, standing perfectly isolated beneath the blazing crystal chandelier. I did not cross my arms. I did not lower my chin. I stood with my spine straight, as a blade my shoulders pulled back, bearing the crushing weight of 100 mocking stares with absolute freezing dignity. For the briefest of seconds, my gaze dragged across the King of Eldoria. Our eyes met. His were grey cold and infinite. Mine were dark, burning, and utterly devoid of fear. I saw the slight, almost imperceptible shift in Kaelen's posture. His gloved hand, which had been resting loosely on the armrest, suddenly stilled. He was looking at a girl in a faded ash-coloured dress, but I knew in that fleeting collision of gazes that he recognized the posture. It was not the posture of a servant waiting to be whipped. It was the posture of a ruler facing a firing squad. Such defiance, Julian mocked, stepping closer to me, the parchment rustling loudly in his grip. Such arrogant posture for a girl whose entire existence relies on my charity. Let us see if that spine holds when the kingdom hears the delusions of your broken mind. Julian hooked his finger under the edge of the parchment. He flicked it open. The sharp tearing sound of the upper wax seal breaking echoed in the silent hall. He cleared his throat, holding my agony up to the candlelight, preparing to read my bloodline's ruin to the world. "Before I read this masterpiece," Julian sneered, stepping down from the dais so that the hem of his midnight velvet coat brushed dangerously close to my grey silk. "It is only fitting that the author assumes the proper position. Kneel, Alara. If you wish to play the part of a fallen queen, you must learn how to beg." I did not move. I looked him dead in the eye, my chin held perfectly level. Julian's smile tightened into a cruel, jagged line. He gave a sharp nod to the heavily armored guard standing behind me. The heavy wooden shaft of a pike slammed brutally into the back of my knees. My legs gave out. I hit the polished white marble with a bone-jarring crack. The bitter freezing cold of the stone immediately bit through the thin, faded fabric of my gown, sinking directly into my joints. A few ladies at the banquet table gasped, followed swiftly by hushed, excited whispers. But I did not collapse. I caught my balance, folding my legs elegantly beneath me, keeping my spine as straight and unyielding as the iron bars of my tower window. I rested my bleeding hands in my lap. I did not look at the floor. I looked straight ahead, bearing the public shame like a heavy, invisible crown. Satisfied, Julian stepped back into the blazing light of the chandeliers. He unfolded the parchment entirely. "My dearest brother," Julian began, raising his voice to ensure it reached the farthest corners of the cavernous hall. He adopted a high-pitched, mockingly tragic tone. "It has been 4 years since the ravens brought the news of your fall at Blackwood Ridge. 4 years since the winter snows buried your body and the traitors buried our name. A ripple of cruel amusement moved through the nobles. Blackwood Ridge was the infamous slaughter, where the old king's forces were finally crushed. To them it was a victory to be celebrated. To me it was the graveyard of my soul. I am writing this because the silence in this castle is suffocating me." Julian read on, pacing slowly in front of the high table, relishing every syllable. "I sit in the ashes of our house. I watch the usurpers wear our mother's jewels. I watch a coward sit in our father's chair, drinking from cups paid for by our blood. I'm treated as a ghost, a nameless servant, forced to scrub the very stones where our family was massacred." "Oh, the absolute drama of it all," Lady Vespera called out from the dais, fanning herself lazily with her painted silk fan. "She truly believes she is the Valerius ghost." Laughter echoed off the vaulted ceiling. It was sharp, ugly, and deafening. I felt my lungs burning against the tight lacing of my corset. Every word Julian read was a piece of my soul, torn out and thrown onto the banquet tables for the dogs to chew on. But I forced my breathing to slow. I focused on the stinging pain in my scraped palm, using the physical sensation to anchor me to the present, refusing to let them see me break. I would not weep for their entertainment. "But I want you to know, Cassian, that I'm not broken," Julian read, speaking my brother's name aloud. The name hit the heavy air like a physical strike. "They can strip me of my titles. They can force me into rags. They can make me live in the freezing towers like a prisoner. But they cannot wash the royal blood from my veins. I am the last of the Silver Griffins. I am the true daughter of this kingdom." The laughter abruptly died down, replaced by murmurs of mock outrage. To claim the name of the Silver Griffin, even in a delusion, was a treasonous offense. I dared to shift my gaze slightly toward the high table. King Kaelen had not moved, but the atmosphere around him had violently altered. He was no longer leaning back in his chair. He was sitting perfectly upright. The wine goblet he had been holding was resting on the oak table, his large scarred hand still gripping the silver stem. His knuckles had gone entirely bone-white. His storm-dark eyes were locked onto my kneeling form with an intensity that made the air in my lungs evaporate. He knew the name Cassian. He had fought shoulder to shoulder with him at Blackwood Ridge. Cassian had spoken of a sister, a princess left behind in the south. The kingdom had been told she died in the coup. Kaelen was looking at me, a girl kneeling in the dirt, and the heavy, lethal gears in his mind were suddenly spinning. Julian, entirely blind to the terrifying shift in the Winter King's posture, continued his theatrical performance. "I survived this exile because I made you a promise the night before you rode north." Julian read, his voice dripping with condescension. "I promised I would guard the final piece of our legacy. In the small hours of the night I hold The heavy brass matrix you sent me from the battlefront. I hold the royal seal. Julian paused, lowering the paper. He looked down at me, a cruel, pitying smile stretching across his face. A royal seal. Really, Alara? Did you steal a doorknob from the kitchens and pretend it was the king's signet? He shook the folded parchment dismissively to emphasize his joke. He did not know. He hadn't checked the deep folds of the heavy paper. He thought it was just a madwoman's diary. As Julian violently shook the letter, the heavy, tarnished brass matrix of the silver griffin slipped from between the pages. It fell through the air in agonizing slow motion. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, heavy ringing clank that cut through the murmurs of the hall like a gunshot. It bounced twice the deeply carved face of the roaring griffin, catching the blazing light of the crystal chandeliers before coming to a stop exactly halfway between my kneeling form and the high table. The room went dead silent. The ringing of the brass against the polished marbles seemed to echo for an eternity. It was a heavy, ancient sound carrying the weight of centuries of unbroken lineage striking against the stolen floor of the great hall. The brass matrix sat exactly halfway between the high table and the spot where my knees were pressed into the freezing stone. Under the blazing light of the crystal chandeliers, the deep, intricate carving of the silver griffin was unmistakable. It was not a cheap replica. It was not a kitchen doorknob. It was the sovereign seal of House Valerius, an artifact that had sealed treaties, declared wars, and legitimized the crown for 300 years. Duke Julian Vance stared at it, his cruel smile faltering into a look of dull confusion. He did not immediately comprehend what he was looking at. To a man who had built his power on forgery and lies, the sudden appearance of absolute truth was incomprehensible. What in the world? Julian muttered, stepping down from the dais. He let out a nervous, breathy laugh, trying desperately to maintain his hold over the room's amusement. Look at the lengths this mad woman goes to. A stolen paperweight to legitimize her little delusion. He reached down to pick it up. Do not touch it. The voice did not shout. It did not echo. It was spoken at a low-level pitch, yet it possessed a terrifying physical weight that slammed into the chest of every person in the great hall. It was the sound of a blade being drawn in a dark room. Julian froze. His hand hovered mere inches above the brass seal. He slowly straightened up his face, draining of all color, as he turned to look at the high table. King Kaelen had stood up. The movement was slow, fluid, and lethal. The heavy wolf fur cloak slid from his shoulders, pooling like dark blood on the back of his chair. The massive vaulted ceiling suddenly seemed too low for the sheer, staggering pressure radiating from the Winter King. He did not look at Julian. He was looking at the brass object on the floor. Your Majesty. Julian whispered, his voice trembling, the arrogant bluster entirely shattered. It is merely a piece of junk, she. Step away from it, Vance, Kaelen said softly. Julian practically threw himself backwards, stumbling over the hem of his own midnight velvet coat, leaving the seal isolate on the white marble. Kaelen descended the steps of the dais. His heavy leather boots made no hurried sounds, but the slow, measured pace was infinitely worse. It was the approach of an executioner. The noble court stopped breathing. Lady Vespera's painted fan slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, but no one dared to look away. I remained on my knees, my spine straight, my bleeding hands resting quietly in the lap of my faded grey silk dress. The corset bit into my ribs, restricting my air, but my heart was beating with a violent, deafening rhythm. I watched the Winter King walk toward me. He stopped a few feet away. He did not immediately pick up the seal. Instead, he slowly crouched down, dropping to one knee upon the same cold marble they had forced me onto. It was an astonishing movement, an act of sheer, unthinking grace from a sovereign ruler in a hall full of traitors. Kaelen reached out with his right hand, the hand marked by a jagged white scar across the knuckles, and picked up the brass matrix. He held it up to the candlelight. His thumb traced the raised wings of the silver griffin sliding over the familiar grooves and indentations. I saw the muscles in his jaw lock. I saw the color drain entirely from his scarred features, leaving a pale, terrifying mask of absolute realization. Cassian had carried that seal through 3 brutal winters in the northern campaigns. Kaelen had seen it. He had seen Cassian use it to stamp the wax on orders that had saved Kaelen's own life, and he had been there covered in the mud and blood of Blackwood Ridge when Cassian had desperately handed the seal to a messenger bleeding out into the snow, begging for it to be taken to his sister, Elysia. My sister's name is Elysia. Find her, Kaelen. Do not let them erase her. Kaelen slowly lowered his hand. He turned his head and looked at me. For the first time since he had entered the hall, Kaelen of Aldoria truly saw me. He did not see Alara, the tragic servant, in the ash-colored gown. He saw the sharp, aristocratic line of my jaw, identical to the brother who had died for him. He saw the dark burning pride in my eyes that 4 years of starvation and humiliation had failed to extinguish. He saw the bruised bleeding palms resting with absolute dignity on my lap. The silence between us hummed with the force of a collapsing star. I saw the exact moment the truth rearranged the inside of his chest. I saw the horror dawn in his grey eyes, the horrifying realization that the kingdom he had spent the last 2 years stabilizing was built upon a lie. He had broken bread with the usurpers. He had accepted the hospitality of the man who had ordered the royal family slaughtered. And the true queen, the sister he had sworn a dying man he would protect, had been forced to her knees just inches from his boots. A slow, terrifying tremor ran through the hand that held the royal seal. Kaelen closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, the coldness was gone. In its place was a fury so deep, so purely destructive that the air in the great hall seemed to actively chill. He stood up, clutching the silver griffin tightly in his fist. He did not look at the nobles. He did not look at Lady Vespera, who was suddenly trembling violently in her chair. He turned his storm-dark gaze slowly, inevitably, upon Duke Julian Vance. "Where did you get this paper, Julian?" Kaelen asked, his voice a lethal, deadly whisper that carried to the very back walls. Julian swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his pale forehead. I found it, Your Majesty, beneath her floorboards, in the servants' tower. It is just a... You forced a woman to her knees to mock a fallen soldier. Kaelen interrupted, his voice dropping another octave. You brought this out for entertainment. She is nobody, Julian cried out desperately, gesturing a trembling hand toward me. She is a delusional orphan. She is dirt. Kaelen's jaw clenched so hard, I thought the bone might snap. The Winter King turned fully toward the dais, slipping the royal seal into his pocket, his hand moving to the heavy hilt of the broadsword strapped to his hip. The faint lethal whisper of Aldorian steel sliding a mere fraction of an inch from its scabbard was the only sound in the great hall. It was not a battle cry. It was a promise of absolute uncompromising violence bound entirely in royal restraint. Give me the letter, Julian Kaelen commanded. The words did not echo. They dropped like anvils onto the polished marble. Julian's hands shook so violently that the parchment rattled like dry leaves in a winter storm. He extended it outward, his pale eyes wide, with a terror he could no longer mask beneath velvet and titles. He did not understand what he had done, only that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Kaelen snatched the parchment from the usurper's trembling grip. The Winter King did not look at Julian. He looked down at the crumpled pages, smoothing them open with his large leather-clad hands. The hands that had fought wars, the hands that had buried kings now treated my stolen grief with the reverence of a sacred text. I watched him from my position on the floor. The cold of the marble had entirely seeped into my bones, numbing my legs, but the fire burning in my chest kept me anchored. I did not lower my gaze. I watched Kaelen read the words I'd written in the darkest, most desperate hour of my life. I saw the exact moment he read the lines about my faded dresses. I saw his eyes track over the sentences describing the physical accumulation of 1,000 tiny humiliations. The scrubbing of the floors, the scraping of the plates, the constant suffocating fear of the man standing before him. A muscle feathered in Kaelen's locked jaw. He folded the letter slowly, meticulously, as a man folds a banner of war he intends to preserve for history. He slipped it inside his heavy leather tunic directly over his heart, placing it alongside the brass seal of the silver griffin. When Kaelen finally looked up at Julian, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet below freezing. You found this funny, Your Grace? Kaelen asked. His voice was a terrifyingly quiet thing. You found amusement in a woman mourning her brother. Your Majesty, I assure you it was a jest. Julian babbled, taking another desperate step backward. He bumped into the edge of the heavy banquet table, sending a silver platter clattering, but no one moved to catch it. She is a servant. She fabricates these lies to elevate herself above her station. The name Cassian. It is a common name. Cassian Valerius was not a common name. Kaelen stated, his voice cutting through the usurper's panicked excuses like a scythe through wheat. The name hung in the air of the Great Hall. It was a name that had been outlawed by Julian's decree, a name that carried the penalty of the gallows if spoken aloud. Hearing it fall from the lips of the Winter King sent a visible shockwave through the assembled nobility. Several lords visibly recoiled, their faces draining of blood. Cassian Valerius was the crown prince of this realm. Kaelen continued stepping closer to Julian. The sheer physical disparity between the two men was staggering. Kaelen, a sovereign forged in ice and iron, and Julian, a fat, sweating parasite dressed in stolen velvet. He was a commander of unparalleled brilliance. He was a man who gave his own cloak to his soldiers, who ate last, who fought first. He was the man who saved my life at Blackwood Ridge when your cowardly faction refused to send reinforcements. Julian swallowed heavily, his throat bobbing. Your Majesty, we did not know. You knew, Kaelen interrupted softly. You knew exactly who he was, and you knew exactly what you were doing when you slaughtered his house while he was bleeding out in the snow to protect your borders. Lady Vespera let out a small strangled whimper from her chair on the dais. Kaelen did not even glance at her. His absolute predatory focus remained on Julian. For 2 years, I have searched for the sister Cassian begged me to protect with his dying breath. Kaelen said, the quiet volume of his voice forcing the entire hall to lean in, breathless and terrified. He told me her name. He told me she had the pride of an empress and the stubbornness of a warlord. He told me he had sent her the royal seal, the only legitimate claim to the throne you currently occupy. I tore the northern provinces apart looking for her. I wrote to every noble house. And you, Julian Vance, sent me a letter explicitly stating that the Valerius bloodline had ended. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a kingdom realizing it had backed the wrong side of history. I was informed she perished in the coup, Julian stammered, lying through his teeth, the sweat ruining the expensive collar of his coat. If this girl is truly... if she is who she claims nothing. Kaelen stepped entirely into Julian's personal space, towering over him. She did not speak. You forced her into the light. You paraded her pain for your own entertainment. You made the true heir of this kingdom scrub the floors of her own castle, and then you ordered her to her knees in front of me. I did not know. Julian screamed, the facade of Papua entirely breaking, leaving only a pathetic, terrified man. I swear to you on my life, I did not know you cared for the Valerius line. Your life, Kaelen whispered, leaning down so only Julian and I could hear the absolute finality in his words, was forfeit the second you handed me that letter. But your execution is not mine to order. Kaelen turned away from the trembling, broken Duke. He left Julian gasping for air against the banquet table and walked back toward the center of the room. He walked toward me. The anger that had radiated from him like a furnace instantly vanished as he approached. He stopped just inches from where my knees were planted on the freezing marble. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with the profound, staggering respect of a sovereign recognizing his equal. The entire noble court of Oak Haven watched in breathless, paralyzed shock as the ruthless king of the north slowly lowered himself, bowing his head, not to the lord of the castle, but to the girl in the faded grey dress. King Kaelen did not reach down and pull me to my feet. He did not treat me like a fragile, broken thing that needed to be rescued. Instead, he remained in his slight bow, extending his scarred, leather-clad hand toward me, palm open, waiting. He was offering me the choice to rise under my own power using his strength only as an anchor. Princess Elysia, Kaelen said. The name, my true name, unspoken for 4 agonizing years, hung in the dead silence of the great hall. It felt strange to hear it out loud, heavy and ancient, a ghost suddenly given flesh and breath. You have knelt on this freezing stone long enough. The Winter King continued, his low voice wrapping around the words with absolute, unyielding respect. Rise. I slowly lifted my hand from the lap of my faded, grey silk dress. My fingers were numb, my palms smeared with dried blood from the stone wall of the tower. I placed my hand into his. His grip was warm, solid, and impossibly strong. With a slow, deliberate movement, ignoring the burning ache in my joints, I stood up. I did not let go of his hand immediately, and he did not release mine. We stood side by side, facing the high table. I was wearing the gown of ashes, my hair pinned back severely, my face pale. but standing next to the towering lethal sovereign of Aldoria, under the blazing crystal chandeliers of my own ancestral hall, I knew exactly what the court saw. They saw the silver griffin. They saw the bloodline they had tried to bury. Kaelen turned his storm-dark gaze to the paralyzed crowd of nobles. I present to you Princess Elysia of House Valerius. Kaelen's voice boomed, stripped of its quiet restraint, ringing out with the crushing authority of a commander on a battlefield. The true and only legitimate heir to the throne of Oakhaven, the sister of my commander and the holder of the sovereign seal. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. The sheer terror of being caught feasting in the stolen hall of a living heir washed over the banquet table. Lord Harrying, the man who had laughed the loudest at my letter, collapsed to his knees so fast he knocked over his chair. Within seconds, a domino effect of panic swept through the room. Silk rustled, silver clattered, and one by one, the nobles of the court dropped to the polished marble floor. They bowed. The very people who had whispered the word servant as I walked past them were now pressing their foreheads to the stone. Only Duke Julian Vance remained standing, leaning heavily against the high table, his face a grotesque mask of denial and terror. You cannot do this! Julian shrieked, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his lips. He pointed a trembling fat finger at Kaelen. I am the Duke. I hold the royal decree of the High Council. She is a ghost. She has no army. She has nothing. She has mine, Kaelen stated coldly. He did not raise his voice, but the threat was absolute. And a decree written by traitors and stamped with forged wax is entirely void. The real seal is in my pocket. The real queen is standing beside me. Julian let out a pathetic, strangled sob. He looked frantically around the room, searching the faces of the kneeling lords for any sign of support, any faction willing to draw swords for him. He found nothing but the tops of their bowed heads. Kaelen turned to me. The fury in his eyes softened entirely as he looked down into my face, replaced by a quiet, expectant deference. The usurper is yours. Your grace, Kaelen said softly, stepping back half a pace to yield the floor to me. What is your command? For 4 years, I had held my tongue. I had swallowed my rage, hidden my tears, and allowed these monsters to treat me like dirt beneath their boots. Now the weight of the kingdom rested on my tongue. I let go of Kaelen's hand. I took one step forward, the grey silk sweeping over the floor. Julian Vance, I said. My voice was no longer the quiet, inflectionless tone of a servant. It was cold sharp, and carried the undeniable cadence of a ruling monarch. Julian's knees finally buckled. He dropped to the floor, weeping openly, his midnight velvet coat pooling around him. You stripped my family of their lives, their name, and their home. I continued, looking down at the pathetic creature who had tormented me. You forced me to wear rags and scrub the blood of my kin from these very stones. You believed you could break me by parading my grief before the court. I paused, letting the silence sharpen the blade of my next words. But you forgot one fundamental truth, Julian. A crown is not made of gold. It is made of endurance. I shifted my gaze to the dais, locking eyes with Lady Vespera. She was frozen in her chair, her face as white as chalk. Take off my mother's earrings, Vespera, I commanded. I looked back down at Julian. I did not need to shout. True power never has to shout. Guards, I said, looking toward the 4 men in Vance livery who stood paralyzed by the doors. The very guards who had mocked me less than an hour ago. Strip this man of his velvet. Drag him to the eastern tower. He's fond of the cold there. Lock him in the dark, without a coat, without a fire, and without a title. Let him see how long he survives the winter he created. The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, their eyes darting from the weeping duke to Kaelen of Aldoria, whose hand rested casually on the hilt of his broadsword. The choice was obvious. They marched forward, grabbing Julian roughly by the arms. No, please, Alada Princess, mercy! Julian screamed as they hauled him across the marble floor. Mercy! I whispered, watching him being dragged away. Is a privilege reserved for those who do not mock the dead. Julian's frantic, pathetic screams faded down the long vaulted corridors of Oakhaven, growing fainter until the heavy oak doors of the eastern wing severed the sound entirely. The silence that rushed in to fill the great hall was profound. It was not the tense, expectant quiet that had preceded the king's arrival. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total defeat. Not a single noble dared to raise their head from the polished marble. The glittering jewels, the velvet coats, the silken skirts, All of it was pressed into the freezing stone in a desperate display of submission. Lady Vespera remained slumped in her chair on the dais, her face buried in her hands, weeping with a quiet, wretched despair. She looked entirely unremarkable, without my mother's sapphires shining at her throat. I stood at the center of the hall, the adrenaline that had sustained my defiance slowly beginning to ebb. With the immediate threat removed, the physical reality of my condition rushed back in. The tight lacing of the corset ached against my ribs, and my knees throbbed with a dull, bruised heat from the brutal impact against the floor. And the air stripped of the chaotic energy of the banquet felt suddenly bitterly cold against the thin grey silk of my faded gown. A violent involuntary shiver racked my shoulders. King Kaelen noticed it instantly. He did not ask if I was unwell. A king of the north did not waste time with hollow questions, when the solution was obvious. He turned his broad shoulders and walked with measured heavy steps up the stairs of the dais. He passed Lady Vespera, as if she were nothing more than a piece of broken furniture, his gaze fixed solely on the back of his chair where he had left his heavy cloak. He lifted the massive garment of midnight leather and thick wolf fur. He carried it back down to where I stood. "Pardon me, your grace," Kaelen murmured, his voice pitched so low that only I could hear the rough, gentle cadence of it. He stepped behind me and draped the cloak over my shoulders. The sheer weight of it was staggering, a grounding physical force that immediately enveloped me in astonishing warmth. It smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and the sharp, clean scent of the northern winds. It swallowed the drab grey silk entirely, falling past my knees and sweeping the floor. He stepped to my front and meticulously fastened the heavy silver clasp at my collarbone. His knuckles, marked by the white scar of battle, briefly brushed against the cold skin of my neck. "You will never shiver in this castle again." Kaelen said, his storm-dark eyes locking onto mine, carrying a promise that felt as heavy and binding as an iron chain. "Thank you." I whispered the words, barely making it past the tight knot in my throat. It was the first act of genuine care I'd received in 4 years, and it took every ounce of my royal training not to let the tears finally fall. Kaelen turned his attention back to the room. The lethal, commanding edge returned to his posture instantly. "Commander," Kaelen called out. From the shadows, near the grand entrance, the captain of his Kingsguard stepped forward, his Eldorian armor clinking softly. "Yes, your majesty. Secure the treasury, the armory, and all exits." Kaelen ordered, his voice echoing over the cowering nobility. "No one leaves this hall until the perimeter is locked. Furthermore, these lords and ladies will remain on their knees until the queen has departed the room. If any man raises his head before the doors close behind us, you have my permission to remove it." "It will be done." The commander bowed perfectly. Kaelen turned back to me. He did not offer his hand this time to lead me like a child. He offered his arm, bending his elbow slightly, a gesture of escort suitable for an equal sovereign. I rested my hand on his thick leather sleeve. The contrast between my pale, bruised fingers and his dark armor was striking. Together we turned our backs on the high table, on the usurper's sister, and on the agonizing memories of the last 4 years. We walked down the long central aisle of the great hall. When I had entered this room an hour ago, I had walked alone, a ghost in a gown of ashes, running a gauntlet of mockery and cruel whispers. Now I walked, enveloped in the fur of a conqueror, anchored by the arm of a king. The nobles who had laughed at my pain were now nothing more than a carpet of trembling bodies lining my path. I did not look down at them. They were no longer worth the expenditure of my anger. As we reached the massive oak doors, the Eldorian guards pushed them open, standing at strict, terrifying attention. We crossed the threshold, leaving the blazing light and the suffocating scent of the banquet behind. We moved into the lower gallery. The few servants who had been lingering in the corridors, the very people who had watched Julian's men drag me up and down these stairs, took one look at the towering king of the north and the massive fur cloak draped over my shoulders, and they immediately dropped to the floor. The news of the great hall had not yet spread, but power required no translation. The castle recognized its master. Kaelen did not lead me toward the freezing eastern tower. He guided me toward the west wing, the ancient royal apartments that Julian had kept locked and untouched because he feared the ghosts inside them. "My men will clear the royal solar for you," Kaelen said softly as we walked through the quiet torch-lit corridors. "A fire will be lit. A physician will tend to your hands, and tomorrow we will summon the High Council. They will resist, I said, my voice steady despite my exhaustion. The council put Julian in power. They fear the Valerius name. Kaelen looked down at me, a faint, dangerous shadow of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. Let them fear it, Elysia, he said quietly. A kingdom that has forgotten how to kneel to its rightful queen must be taught the lesson from the beginning, and I have brought a very large army to serve as the instructors.